Okay, perfect. Thanks, Tanzil. Yeah, okay. So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you very much for coming. My name is Angela Betcha, and on behalf of the Decolonial Cities Collective and today's hosts, who are Naluvembe Binaisa and Delacey Tedesco and myself, I would like to welcome you to our second Decolonial Cities Dialogue, which looks at decolonial city making from the perspective of art, fashion, music, and aesthetics more broadly. We are very excited to welcome our speakers today, Professor Peju Layiwola, and our speakers from Red City Solidarity Disco and the African Fashion Research Institute, whom we will introduce in more detail shortly. So some of you may have attended our first dialogue, but those of you who haven't, I'd like to say a few words about the collective and how this dialogue series came into being before Delacey is going to introduce today's event and the running order. So the Decolonial Cities Collective is an interdisciplinary group of researchers based in the UK and Canada, which is interested in establishing a community of practice towards furthering our commitment to decoloniality, social justice, and care in cities. The collective was founded in 2022 as an outcome of a workshop organized by the British Academy and the Canadian Institute of Advanced Research, where we were asked to think about the question, what is a good city? And from these discussions emerged this collective, which is an initiative now to engage with knowledge production and political work in and on decolonial cities. The collective now facilitates dialogues between activists and academics through a series of periodic conversations called Decolonial Cities Dialogues, of which this is the second iteration today. We also have a website, and we will put a link to the website in the chat now for you to check out our project. So for the second dialogue today, we will learn about 3 practices in different cities and different countries. So that shall be very exciting. As Tanzil has already mentioned, today's event will be recorded. So if you don't want to appear on the recording, maybe go off camera. So I'm handing over now to Delacey to introduce today's dialogue and how we are going to proceed.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming, or good afternoon or good evening, regardless of where you're located. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge that I'm participating this morning from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Syilx Nation, also known as the Okanagan Nation or the Okanagan people, in the interior southern region of British Columbia, so on the west side of Canada. Our event today, in thinking about decolonial cities and sort of creative aesthetic practices, arose from our shared interest in understanding how creative practice in a range of aesthetic modes can work to intervene in urban spaces that are shaped by and still grappling with histories and presence of coloniality. We're also definitely interested in how creative practice as a specific mode of intervention can help us maybe rethink and understand better some of the terms that we might tend to use, such as urban or decoloniality or aesthetics. So we see this as an opportunity to pose questions in a few directions at once. Our invited speakers will be introduced one at a time at the beginning of each of their sessions, at which point they will offer us a 10-minute presentation on the work that they are undertaking on these themes. We'll put their links to their bios and affiliations in the chat so you can learn more about each of them. After all 3 invited guests have presented, we'll open to questions, starting first with a question that each of us poses to the guest that we invited. Please put your questions in the chat at any time through the presentations and during the first round of questions. And then depending on time and where we're at with questions in the chat, we'll either do another round of questions that we pose that try and maybe draw out some of the linking themes, or we will move directly to audience questions or bounce back and forth between the two. So please welcome the invited guests with us. We are hoping that everyone can keep an eye on time with so many participants. We just ask that whether it's presentations or questions, we try and keep an eye on time to ensure that we can maximize the collective dialogue that we're having today. So I would like to pass to Naluembe to introduce our first speaker.
Hello, everybody in your different time zones. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. And thank you again on my behalf and on everybody's behalf in the DCC for joining us today. So I have an amazing honor to introduce Professor Peju Laiwola, who I've been a long-time admirer of all of her work, amazing work as an artist, as a scholar, and as an activist. She's an art historian based at the University of Lagos, and she's an internationally regarded mixed media artist and activist. Her interventions through scholarship and practice give visibility to Benin's enduring cosmology as a sophisticated ancient African city. So helping us to think that the urban did not start with colonialism. You know, urban living has been an outstanding feature of the landscape of Africa before colonialism. And Professor Laiwola is a committed advocate for the return of the Benin bronzes and is the immediate past president of the Arts Council of the African Studies Association, USA, commonly known as ACASA. So with no further ado, Professor, I give the screen to you, and I'm sharing your presentation from my laptop, so let me do that now.
Thank you very much, Nalu. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, good. Okay. So can we use the first slide? Okay, so that's the title of my talk. Hello, everyone. We need to go to the next slide. And these are the Benin bronzes, the works that I've been engaging with in my projects. And they are usually regarded as Benin bronzes, even though they come in different materials like wood, brass, leather, textile, sometimes vegetal matter. Sometimes you even have a work that might have up to 7 or even 8 materials. And the next slide shows the king of Benin to show that this is also a living culture, one that is still in practice. There are several festivals and rituals that still go on. And so these works of art that were looted from the palace of the king by British forces in 1897 are still very relevant to the culture. So I grew up in Benin City. I was inspired by the songs, the language, and art making that went on in the city. And I took pride in the culture. The city of Benin spoke to me in many ways. I was brought up by an artist mother, an Edo princess, Elizabeth Olo, a great storyteller who not only narrated stories of Benin, but expressed them through her bronze sculptures. And these inspiring moments of learning from her shaped my imagination. So little wonder that many of my artistic projects have centered Benin. And this is a roll call of the projects I've done. Even others are not listed here, like what I did under the group called Artifact, a civil society group which held exhibitions in Dresden, in Germany, and in Spain. So the very first one, Benin1897.com, indeed was the first art exhibition in Nigeria to focus on this story of pillage. And it held in 2 galleries at the University of Lagos and Ibadan in Nigeria, and then moved to Benin in another form in 2014. And you recall that in 2010, very little was discussed about the issue of restitution. So one of the works that I had, there were quite a number of installations, but one of them, the most engaging of them all, was 1,000 heads made in terracotta, and then also had some metal foil, put on the surface of the faces and around the work itself. It had a terracotta plaque with a number written there, the dates. And so this work refers to how the works, the classical Benin works were kept in the courtyard by British soldiers when they besieged the palace. So for me, it was important to talk about this at the time and bring it to the front burner. In 2010, there was very little discussion about the restitution of Benin bronzes. So having it in the university environment was also to spark dialogue within the academy. And we also brought in a lot of students and younger generation to understand the importance of cultural history. And we had school children visit. We also created workbooks for them to follow at the level. And already the school children they were new about the Benin art form, because one of the very popular publishers of textbooks uses the logo of the Benin head as logo for the company. So the accompanying catalog had articles written by scholars from the continent and the African diaspora. And it was important for us to tell our own stories and show the perspectives and responses to some of these issues that refer to colonial violence. And one of the writers, Kwame Opoku, who I met in 2007 in Vienna, has written tons and tons of articles, about 300 articles, which can be found on the Modern Ghana website. And if you type Benin bronzes into any of the in search engines, you will find that his name will pop up. But what's also interesting is that popular writers or authors on Benin bronzes and restitution do not as much as make reference to his work. For me, it's important that African students and scholars identify with the ideas that Kwame Opoku expresses in his articles. So we'll look at the next slide, which is the Who Centenary Project, which was a public art project that occurred in 2014, and it comprised dances, photography, performances, and on-site installations. For me, that was the year that marked the centennial year of the amalgamation of the Northern and Southern Protectorate of Nigeria. And of course, the Nigerian state celebrated that. There was a banquet, a big banquet. There was even a song that was formulated to celebrate this coming together of two regions of Nigeria. But as an artist, I thought that we should question, I mean, how do you celebrate colonialism? This was done for the comfort of, for the ease of British administration. And I thought that it would be nice for us to commemorate something different, to celebrate culture and to celebrate the life of the king that was exiled to Calabar, Oba Vorame, who died in 1914. So in a sense, that was the centennial year of his passage. So I invited 10 other artists to join in this iteration, including my mother, who helped design some of the costumes. And we chose the Igun Street as the place for our intervention. And for those who do not know, Igun Street is the historic site for bronze casting, and that's where the descendants of those who cast the works that are contested now, that is where they live and work. So they have their ateliers and their living spaces, in the houses along that street. And for me, it was important for us to acknowledge their contributions in sustaining the tradition of casting for which Benin is known. And so we had processions. The next slide. We had processions from the king's quarters. These are some of the images of artists who took part in the various interventions. And so we had processions, and processions in Benin are quite common. You have processions for funerals, for rituals. And we walked, from the Queen's quarters along the major street known as Airport Road, and then we stayed in front of the palace and moved through the Ring Road, which is the center of the city, and then moved over to Igun Street. For us, it was important to acknowledge vital spots within Benin. And walking also allowed us make contact with Mother Earth while asking to be blessed in return. So we can look at the very short video clip for you to hear the sound and see some of the actions that went on during that intervention. but I could hardly hear the sound. Anyway, so earlier that year, in 2014, we had a Briton, Dr. Adrian Walker, who had inherited 2 objects, 2 Benin bronze works from his grandfather. So he returned them to the king, His Royal Majesty Oba Erediawa, in the palace of the king. And so I'd always wanted this whole idea of returning Benin objects. So for me, since it was not happening, you know, in the international community, works were not coming from there to Nigeria, I thought I should symbolically move some of my own creations to Benin City. So the works, the installations that were done in 2010, I took them physically to Benin, and I always longed to have these works mounted alongside, against the adobe walls of Benin architecture, along the corridors of the palace of the head of the Guild of Casters. That was where I mounted these 1,000 heads, as against the white cube or modern gallery that had shown the works earlier in Lagos and Ibadan. And this, in a sense, was very close to the context in which these works were before they were stolen in 1897. So I also invited the casters to join in this commemoration by placing their works within the installation, and this transformed the entire composition. And it was a novel idea to have artists that were trained in academy collaborating with artists that were groomed in a particular canon of representation. And so this became a site for people to come to talk about the history of Benin, their own involvement, their own connections to this history. And it was really very interesting. So the next slide shows us Jalili Atiku, one of the artists that took part. There were quite a number of interventions. I cannot speak about this for time. He raised an altar in honor of Oba Vorame, which he titled Holy Vorame Cathedral. And he created a book of worship and went about the streets of Benin, calling people to join in his service, which was to hold in an open space at Igun Street. So he spread out his paraphernalia of worship in a place usually used for Christian crusades. And sometimes when you don't have the crusades, it doubles as a space for metal casting, where the casters put out their molds and pour in their metal. And it was also adjacent to a shrine house where the casters venerate their patron deity. So he discarded the use of crucifixes and crosses and decided to use the ancestral head known as Unlao, or the idiophone, which was very similar to one of the works that Dr. Adrian Walker returned, as icons, as symbols of his own church. And he had his banner where the king as image is also depicted. And so he went around having this, the hymnals, you can see them in the middle of that circle where he had his service, church service. And so there was also another artist, Juna Nogui, who had a video work, which he installed. He installed a screen in the gallery of Bronze Caster. We didn't want to disrupt the day-to-day activities of this artist. And he titled this Emitere, which looks at the contentious spaces of the body of water that leads from the homelands to the New World, and how bodies of water have been complicated in this north-south dialogue. He reverses the movement of the waves, implying that movement is not unidirectional. The water brings in wealth, much as it takes away wealth in the form of humans and commodities. The work also refers to how water is embedded in Edo mythology as Olokun, the giver of wealth, and also the giver of children, the god or goddess of fertility. And we can see this in the works of, clearly, demonstrated in the works of an artist known as Leo Asemota, a British Edo artist. And so we go on to look at one of my other projects, which I titled Return, and this was in 2018 in South Africa. I was on this residency known as a Raw Residency, researchers and artists and writers residency in Rose University. And so I wanted the environment to speak to me. Instead of taking a predetermined idea, I thought that I should allow South Africa to speak to me. And I was living in the quarters known as the Sarah Batman district in Grahamstown, as it was called at the time. So I wanted to work with the image of Sarah Batman. So in a sense, I used the image of Sarah Batman. Here she's turned upside down. And then also the images from Ashanti, the Ashanti gold weights, the gold some of the looted artifacts from Ethiopia, and of course the Benin works are also included in this. And I tried to put this alongside the image of Tobelo Yonkong, the professor of nanotechnology, who's very well celebrated in South Africa. So I put the story of this woman from Lesotho who has risen so high in the sciences alongside the story of trauma that Sarah Bachman represents. So we'll go on to the next slide. So I raised a commemorative cloth to celebrate her life. And so one other work that I did here was a co-curation in Cologne, Resist, the Art of Resistance. We were 4 curators that were invited from the Global South to curate this exhibition, and we're giving free hand to contextualize our exhibition space. So I also work here with a collection of 96 bronze works that were looted from Benin City and had not been shown. Only 3 in that collection had been shown in the exhibition. So what it means is that most of them had been in storage for several decades. So for me, it was a very humbling experience seeing the works that were taken away from the palace. And I had an encounter when I touched one of the works. It inspired me to write a poem which I recited within the gallery space. So with that, I also opened it up to other artists whose works I showed. Wakuso Eduzie, she does a lot of drawing. She superimposes images from the past and puts them on, images of the present, showing that Benin art is always in dialogue with the past, or Benin history is always in dialogue. And so we also have the work by Alao Lukman, who looks at the Benin plaques and tells us about the possibilities that exist, that beyond metal casting, there are other processes of metal production that we overlook. The use of wires, the use of metal plates, and all of these came to the fore, through his work. And so we go on to
just a quick interruption. Slide. You're over time, just so
yes. I'm actually running up. And this is another exhibition. I miss you working with the same collection. And finally, I'll show you the slide of a video where I was actually taking the ascension marks from the bronze works that are in that collection. And some of them have actually have been taken to Nigeria, have been brought back, restituted. So in a sense, taking away these ascension marks which tell the history and the movement of these works from Nigeria to auction tables, to the museums, in a sense, some form of violence. And this is where I'm going to close. So you can show just about 3 of those bronze works where the marks have been taken off. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Peju. I hand over to Angela. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Peju. That was really fascinating. And I think it already gave us quite a few things to think about later in our discussion. But for now, I'm going to introduce our next speakers from Red City Solidarity Disco, which is a project based in Liverpool in the UK and is run by Theo Temple. Maybe wave into the camera, and Ellie Jane. Theo is a PhD candidate in political geography at King's College London, and Ellie Jane is an MA candidate in art psychotherapy at Sheffield Hallam University. And with Red City Solidarity Disco, they aim to engage with struggles in the city of Liverpool around housing, work, and migration. Red City Solidarity Disco collaborates with grassroots organizers, refugee support services, unions, community law centers, and artistic practitioners to find opportunities for knowledge and resource sharing, as well as fundraising. Theo had asked me to cut out the word, but I'm going to say it anyway. The Red City Solidarity Disco are legendary parties in Liverpool, I think it is safe to say. So yeah, it is wonderful to have you here. So I'll hand over to you too to talk a bit more about this project.
Hi,
Hello, hi everyone. So it's a really nice surprise to be invited to speak about this party that we do. I would say we haven't been orientated towards questions around decolonialism and probably wouldn't be best placed to answer questions around that directly. However, we have been motivated towards practices of solidarity and other political practices that have emerged out of doing parties, but hopefully nonetheless we can contribute to the conversation. So we are Red City Solidarity Disco, which is a semi-regular party fundraiser held at the Bridewell Studios and Gallery in Liverpool. It's one of Liverpool's oldest artist studios, housed in a 19th century police station. In its current form, Red City has been running since 2019, but it has existed in various iterations and changing groups of people in different locations over the past decade. Our loose aim is to support the struggles in the city around housing, work, and migration.
So kind of where a bit of a background, I started doing solidarity fundraiser parties as a student. I co-founded a monthly event, the Bakery Parties in Liverpool, whilst I was in Student Action for Refugees. We raised money for various refugee solidarity groups and helped make a space for students and refugees in Liverpool to meet. Helped spawn various other grassroots groups in the city, a cooperative film screening club, a zine co-op, and other artistic collaborations between people with and without citizenship status. Later, I set up Find the Best Worker Position, a union solidarity fundraiser in London, which I did alongside collaborating with United Voices of the World, a union for mostly low-paid migrant workers working in London, often in outsourced jobs.
Okay, so I first met Theo through the bakery parties, and I really admired the concept of community-focused dance spaces and building a bridge between the culture of nightlife in the city, but also to communities existent around that space as well. My experience as a facilitator and artist has been focused on using art as a medium of connectivity in social spaces, specifically working with young people and families in deprived communities. When Theo asked me to get involved, I began working with local artists to exhibit work and started to realise how much of an amazing space we had with the Bridewell and how we could utilise that a little bit better. So following that, we started setting up a pre-party, which would be working with the organisations that we were fundraising for. And the idea between that is to create a space to be conscious of the social issues that we were fundraising for. And also just use it as a space to share and create through using creativity as a mechanism. So it would be whatever the organisation wanted to use the space for. So maybe a film screening, or I would facilitate an art workshop, or we would just throw paint at the wall, or we would do yoga, or, you know, it would be different each time and respond to whatever the people we were fundraising for might need. It became a really wonderful environment aside from the actual party. That was focused on community and communication and creativity. It felt important for us to recognise the severity of the social issues that we were advocating for, but also provide a sober and creative environment for people to communicate within that.
So yeah, the basic format, we hired a space for the weekend using the smaller room for workshops, film screenings, exhibitions, meetings, and then the bigger room for the party. And these things either run simultaneously or at different times. So, for example, the sorts of collaborations we've made happen. Acorn Union, a tenants union, used the space in the daytime to make a giant bus for their local campaign to bring buses back under local council control. Another event for Solidarity Knows No Borders, many of whom their members are in Comforts Angels, a refugee women's football club in Liverpool. They used the space to screen a documentary they made, to make a banner, and to have a pre-party party with their kids. A second time round, they did a yoga session and had a big dinner. Another Red City, Busy Watch, and Liverpool Anti-Raids, who have recently formed in the city to organise against state violence, did a film screening earlier in the evening. Similarly, Vauxhall Law Centre, which has been providing welfare and housing advice since the 1960s in Liverpool, showed a documentary about their history throughout the night. And for a fundraiser we did for a Sandlink Merseyside, a refugee support organisation in Liverpool, we helped them purchase a minibus and then help decorate it. So outside the party itself, we've used our online sort of presence to sort of share information about, what these various groups are doing. And then we've also used our sort of party telephone line, which is like a message that people get to let them know there's an event coming up, to let people know about demonstrations and eviction resistance when that's happened. And that's been reasonably successful. So far, the collaborations have been quite modest. We have a good rep for making money for people and giving groups a place to do something which is useful to them, and at the very least, just a social space for a lot of people who are obviously excluded for various reasons. We do think that there's a lot that kind of music and art scenes in the city can do and should be doing by way of sort of providing infrastructure. Yeah, we are talking about sort of some future.
Oh,
Hello?
should we carry on?
Carry on. We've sort of speculating on some future plans about what we could be doing around the party, developing a political economy, education initiative, an arts programme, maybe spaces for childcare for our pre-party events. We've had people get in contact to help them kickstart a new kind of grassroots organising group through the party, and people wanting to sort of use the party to support their campaigns around detention and border violence, and separately people who just want to use our party as a sort of base to celebrate people who've just got their immigration status in the UK. So I think there's a kind of recognition that this is a social space, which is, sorry, it's a social space. Obviously, it's a bit ambiguous what it could be. It could be useful to people involved in organising and in political struggles. But it's also just a space where people can access freely, and I think that in itself has sort of value in the city.
So the party has gained a bit of momentum, no doubt, because it's cheap and accessible. It's bring your own drink, which is very appealing with the cost of living crisis currently. It's in a beautiful building and it's really fun, and it makes these connections between things happening in the city, breaks down the idea of a nightclub or a party, and includes other activities. So it's not necessarily like a hedonistic party. It's got a different social conscious to it as well. It lowers the boundaries for people who might not be able to access those scenes. So, for example, we try and run a big guest list with Asylum Link Merseyside and offer invitations for free within the refugee community. Also, I think the popularity of the party evidences how people in Liverpool hope to engage with the injustices that marginalised individuals face in the city, and reflects the solidarity within the community. And using art making and music to advocate provides a different dialogue for individuals to engage with. For example, in the party in which we had, we made bunting with comfort angels prior to the party, and I left it out throughout the party, and people who came to the party added over 100 different individual bunting communicating solidarity with comfort angels in the refugee community.
Obviously, us doing parties is not completely driven by politics. It is fun. There's lots of musical and nightclubbing cultural influences that I think we draw on. But I do think there's some interesting hidden associations between running a party and what it means to act politically. For instance, I think throwing a party is an engagement directly with the crowd, which is basically a sort of social unit which stands behind all our institutions. It involves working out some sort of fair access cost and then giving exemptions, which is a kind of problem of contribution and distribution and fairness. It's about people being in charge versus a distributed responsibility in the space, the problem of power and I guess sovereignty. It's about appropriating a space in collaboration with other people from very different backgrounds. It's something about spontaneity and structure. That is the end. Ironically, for something which has been about breaking down barriers between partying and political struggles, it's still quite a sideline thing that Ellie and I do day to day. I think we're both at this kind of turning point about deciding how far we want to expand it. You know, often these things, when they get a bit of funding and formalize, become slightly trite and more conscious about perpetuating themselves. And at the moment, we're in this kind of great situation where it's quite open-ended, it's very informal, there's lots of energy to throw a party with different groups. But at the same time, it's very feet on the ground. Like, we've raised lots of money, we've materially contributed to political struggles happening in this city. And we're speculating, what could we do with this social space? How could we kind of help reconstruct social space in the city? Where does this fit into how the city is changing, the kind of social crises which are happening locally, nationally, internationally? When is the politics just a bit too much? And, you know, when people just want to have an opportunity to socialize? And how do you maintain this kind of good thing that we have without kind of splashing it all over the internet and changing the dynamic, not engaging with the core group of people that it was for in the first place? How do we decide between different people to collaborate with or to fundraise for? It's a big issue. So anyway, lots of questions, but I guess maybe in reflection, we're quite we're still kind of working out where we're going with this thing, and yeah, we're very interested to know what people have to say. And thank you very much for the invitation, and yeah, looking forward to having a conversation.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much, Theo and Ellie Jane. That was really exciting, and you already raised a lot of questions that we probably also had in our heads. Yeah, perfect. So I'm handing over for now to DeLacy, and we come back to the discussion later. So DeLacy can introduce our next speaker from speakers from AFRI.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I am also operating the PowerPoint on behalf of AFRI, so I will just share my screen and set that up and then offer an introduction. So first, I'd like to welcome all the participants from AFRI who are here today. AFRI is the African Fashion Research Institute, and I've been really fortunate to get to know them and be in conversation with a number of members over the past few years, and I'm so excited that they've been willing to join us today. The four members that we have joining us today are Siviwe James, who is a conceptualist, designer, and research associate, seeking out and creatively interrogating the fragments of fashion that allude to the psychologies, histories, and disruptions of African fashion that have limited, but also hold potential for, African creatives to materialize new ideals of modernity. We have Bongani Tao, who is a decolonial fashion researcher and creative copywriter in Johannesburg. His work features in multiple publications. His creative endeavors include Abengoni, which aims to engage fashion practitioners, activists, artists, performers, designers, etc., by using thinking through fashion as praxis to construct a pedagogy away from colonization, breaking formats and disrupting colonial concepts around formal knowledge production systems and archives. We have Erica de Greef, who explores the spaces of power and resistance in South African fashion, both in the past and the present. She works collaboratively always to prompt critical and creative attention to the possibilities of redress and imagination. Erica is a curator, author, and academic, and is the co-founder of the African Fashion Research Institute and the Refashion Lab. And finally, we have Lesiba Mabitsela, who is a South African interdisciplinary artist and fashion designer based in Johannesburg, South Africa. His design practice incorporates critical fashion and performance studies in an exploration of fashion histories from the African continent. As an artist, Mabitsela's focus concerns ideas surrounding African masculine identities. Mabitsela is also a co-founder of the African Fashion Research Institute. So I'm just so happy to welcome all four of our guests, and I'm very keen to listen to what they have to offer us today and be in conversation.
Thank you so much, DeLacy, and thank you for that introduction. And I'm really very, very pleased to be here with the other presenters, and also just to contribute to this conversation around decoloniality and cities and dialogues. So really where we came together, the African Fashion Research Institute was founded in 2019, and our work has really been shaped by what we consider the need to remember, rethink, and rewrite fashion histories that speak to Afrocentric ways of wearing and knowing and making, you know, the kinds of informations that are completely absent from exhibitions, from books, from imaginations. So really our exploration, and the one that we're going to share today, so I'm really going to try to keep it quite short. I've elected to just share the first 10 minutes, and then hopefully in the discussions, the rest of the team will be able to contribute to the conversation. So really what we're sharing today is what is the fold. And so our recent exploration is really a creative research project that we're very fortunate to get some funding from the British Council as part of their New Narratives program for 2023. And it's a year-long program. And for this work, we want to reach different communities and engage with different partners and knowledge makers. So we really collaborated across a range of partnerships, including an app, a digital app, including a creative agency, including educational spaces, media platforms, residency spaces. So maybe, Delacey, maybe just the next slide. And so what we did with the fold is we've really looked at 3 narratives that we're cohering around this idea of the fold. So these 3 new narratives are stitched together with this kind of research in terms of what is, you know, what is a fold, thinking about it materially, but also what is a fold, thinking about fold conceptually. So Delacey, if you could do the next slide, just let it play. There we go, that one. Yeah. So we've already got 3 projects that we're cohering. So the one is a research residency, a creative research residency between Uganda and South Africa, and we'll share a short snippet of some of that work. The second is a podcast, which really is looking at exploring deeper and more intimate kinds of stories, and that is a project called Unfolded, Refolded, and Folded. And the third is a glossary, and it's an audio-visual glossary where we're really looking at fold words. What does it mean to stitch together words around folds that help us think through and speak about? It's about creating a discourse around African fashion. So if you want to go to the next one, Delacey, and don't get frightened when you hear some hammering going on. So on the left, you will see some hammering with some mallets, and this was in the research residency. It was very loud. It's the first Pan-African research residency that took place in Durban last month. And in the image, you can see Lesiba Maputsela, Ugandan artist Liz Kobisinga and Sheila Nakitenda, and Durban creative Tabiso Nqanana, and together with a botanist from the Durban Botanical Gardens. And together, this research really looked at thinking through Indigenous practices and also local knowledges of pleats and crease making. So the pulp that they were beating in this little video was
I'm sorry, Erica, we've lost your sound.
The next project that we're going to just, sorry, my internet was a bit unstable. The next project that we're just going to take you through is the podcast. So here we're just listening in, and it's about a 3-minute listen. So I just want you to listen, and then I'll just share a little bit further.
Kwesinye isikole izodityaniswa ibe yi-housecraft, where you do mostly cooking.
Okay.
And then ke ngoku wenze ii-projects ezincinci kweli cala nini work.
Le housecraft lena babezayibiza i-home economics. as a subject?
I-home economics ibiba yodwa ke ngoku yona.
Okay.
So kwi-home economics we do izinto ezokupheka nezinto ze-interior decoration qha. Then ke ngoku le bendiyifunda mna as i-housecraft ibidibanisa ukupheka.
Okay.
Idibanise i-interior decoration. Idibanise ukuthunga.
Ezi subjects, was this part of Bantu education, or what sort of education curriculum was this part of?
It was Bantu.
It was still Bantu.
By the time now besifunda. But ingafaniyo kodwa naliya yakuqala.
Okay.
Ibise a little bit ke improved. Qha ke umahluko ke ngoku iyayibona lento ndithi I ended up being a isiXhosa teacher. It was because of it.
Okay.
Because if it was not because of it, we could have been identified and have those special schools for such people, but it was not easy. So the only professions that were easily accessible to Black people, you either ipolisa, inesi, utitshala. So xa ufundile ke kuthiwa uyi-professional somebody, those were the only avenues that were easy for Black people.
Okay. And so how do you end up feeding your calling? Because
okay. Into endiyenzileyo ndiphele phaa ku-grade 12. Nalapho I was not that much fortunate because utitsha libendititsha ku-grade 12 kwakuthiwa ngu-standard 10 ngoko. Ube yena ebenze i-home economics. So engena-interest at all kwicala le-needlework. And then we had to push ourselves.
Thank you so much. Thanks to Lacey, but sorry, it ended very quickly there. I just wanted to, that's fine. I just wanted to, so just to contextualize the podcast a little bit and really sort of thinking through the kind of decolonial practice that we're trying to explore with this question of language and these kinds of foldings and unfoldings between the past and the present, and the way in which history is then written into the now. And I think really importantly, what we're also trying to explore is how do we include other kinds of voices? How do we include other kinds of visibilities? And in particular here, we're looking at a material culture of the Xhosa, the Iqia and the Faskoti. So this podcast is part of a production of intimate encounters of everyday knowledge makers and archivists, really. So together, these projects that we're looking at around a particular material thread are also allowing us to do really important work about creating visibilities, unearthing new kinds of knowledges, and this kind of blending of and blurring of these fashion genealogies that have been absented for so long in African fashion research. So yeah, thank you so much, Delacey, and hopefully we'll have some really interesting dialogue following, and thank you to the other guests as well.
Thank you so much. I'll hand it back to Nalu.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, the combined forces of AFRI and everybody else who's spoken. So now we've come to the Q&A part of our dialogue today. And as you've seen, Angela has also put in the chat a notice for everyone to please put your questions in the chat, where we'll pick them up. We're going to each have one round of questions to each one of our invited speakers. And then following that, we'll, depending on how many questions are in the chat, we will pick them up as we go along, and also try to think about ways in which we can make some links and connections between the very rich presentations we've had the wonderful experience of being part of today. So I will kick off speaking to Peju Laiwola. You can see me? Can you hear me, Peju?
Yes, I can.
Oh, excellent. Thank you again. And my apologies that the sound didn't work on the video so well. But these are the dangers of Zoom technology. But I think at least people got an impression of, you had such a rich and full presentation. And really, I want to actually take you to my question is related to this work you've done, which is public art, but at the same time, in a very activist modality, taking this question of resistance to the streets of Lagos and involving the members of the public, or the streets of Benin, as you demonstrated in the video clip we saw. And I just wanted to ask your reflections on what have you seen as the impact of engaging everyday people through this type of practice to think about these questions of resisting very persistent colonial narratives of how Great Britain was in terms of, its rule over the different parts of Africa. And as you give us those reflections, I'd also like to ask you to kind of link them to your work in Cologne, where again that was in a public environment. There's the intervention you made, but within the space of the museum, and also with a diaspora community. So I just wanted your thoughts and reflections on that as we think about this, the different forces across these urban spaces. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Nali, for that question. The public arts project, the Whose Centenary, which held in Benin, first of all, the location, like I said, was a historical site. It's a very important part of the history of Benin. And the fact that we had this intervention, not in a regular space, a closed gallery, but along the streets, also made it open to participation from people from that community. People were passing by. And also the fact that Jedili Atiku, the artist who did the performance, was going about different streets, calling people into Egun Street, was also a very important aspect. For me, I saw that intervention as a very unique form of community engagement and audience participation. It was a platform for sharing, coming together, recounting memories and history. And it provided a form of catharsis and healing for those who were sharing these stories. Because when you hear about the incursion, the British incursion to Benin City, common people were also affected by this. They had family histories, they had family losses. And so having the artists who were complaining about not having access to the works of their predecessors, alongside those who would talk about histories or memories that we couldn't even relate with, was quite interesting. So I also think that it was very important that it was also a way of seeing how art could be consumed within an African context, where the presence of a visual form of art is done alongside dances, performances, chants, and music, and whatever else is included in bringing the art form alive. So in the case of Cologne, these were works that had not been shown to the public. So in a sense, the German public, what these works have been, were getting to see these works for the very first time. The very first exhibition we had, the Resist exhibition, had these works in their storage containers. But when we had the I Miss You exhibition, they were mounted as individual pieces in their own boxes. And what is interesting again too is that there's so much said about the fact that Africans cannot keep or maintain their art forms. They can't maintain their museums, their own spaces. And what we find here that some of the boxes were left empty because some of the works were missing. So it brings to question a lot of things. It exposes a lot of things that were not privy to before we had a project. It was also a learning process for us. The I Miss You exhibition, very much like the one we had in Egun Street, the Whose Centenary, was also a platform for healing, because people came and they were putting out little messages and sticking them on a board. And for them, it was about some form of catharsis, the same way that the whole Centenary Project played out for the people of Benin.
Thank you so much. That's an amazing answer. Thank you. We'll come back to you.
Yeah, so I'm going to follow up with a question for Red City Solidarity Disco. I was wondering, in terms of this whole concept of city making, how do you decide which charities you want to support? And were there any moments where you were maybe approached by a charity and you said, oh, that's a really good cause, but it doesn't really fit with what we want to be doing? Or in other words, who are the communities that you specifically want to empower through your projects?
So yeah, we definitely had been in situations where people have asked whether we could collaborate with them, and we've decided against it. I think we are trying to be kind of present and relevant to like things which are happening right now, and kind of crises which are emerging in locally and nationally, and be aware about, for example, emerging new kind of laws around migration, and also cost of living crisis, how people are just about making ends meet. I think that kind of loose paradigm about making decisions. People have got in contact to do stuff around solidarity stuff with Palestine, which we're more than happy to do. But we have prioritised stuff which is local, and where people who are directly affected by those things can engage in the making of the event. Maybe not just in making the event, but utilise the space. I think that that's a way of drawing things together, and it has more energy. But yeah, it's a problem. We need to sort of develop a way of deciding, and I guess the best way to do that would be to develop some sort of democratic structure where the people who attend the party can maybe make a decision about how who we fundraise for and stuff. Yeah, I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah.
Oh, no, it definitely does. If I may, I'd like to ask one brief follow-up question, which is, how do you see the engagement, of, for example, if you are fundraising for refugees in the actual party? Do you think they are largely separate, or do you feel that a lot of, the communities you are working with actually also attend the parties and have a little boogie?
Yeah, some of them do, but I mean, in the context of when we've had sessions in the pre-party for mums and babies, obviously that wouldn't really be appropriate. But yeah, some of them do. They stick around afterwards. But we also are aware that it can be quite overwhelming as well. The lights and sound and music, and people come to Red City sometimes just for a party, and recognise that might be a little bit intimidating as well. But in terms of how we create that connection, I guess that's through the use of the gallery space and always having a link to the who we're fundraising for, whether we screen a film about the organisation or do a collaborative art piece.
Okay.
I think, but yeah, it is difficult because it's not always so obvious that you can make that social space work. I think it takes work, and you want to give people space to utilize it, and not be tokenistic about your invitation to refugees in Liverpool to make it meaningful, and just recognize that the obvious barriers to just being able to do normal things that young people do in the city.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Okay, I just thank you to all of our guest speakers. The presentations were amazing, and I see so many rich and interesting connections. I've got a flurry of questions, but I'm going to try and hold it to just one at the outset. So I'm wondering, in relation to the range of different forms of creative practice, and the music and the artistic interventions and so on that we've been able to listen in on today, I was hoping that whether it's Bongani or Siviwe, I don't see Lesiba on, but maybe he's able to join us still. I was wondering if someone or more than one could reflect on what fashion as a creative practice brings into this environment that's maybe distinctive, or what it is that that draws you to working through fashion to address the sorts of questions that you're interested in, and maybe as a bit of a extension on that, if you want to consider it, thinking about the relationship between fashion and fashioning and the sort of city making processes that you might be intervening in. So please, anyone from AFRI, feel free to jump in with response.
So, would you like to go first, or should I?
Please go ahead.
I think fashion is quite integral in thinking about identity, especially in environments that are also designed, but designed in a manner that displaces, that enforces hierarchy, colonial hierarchy at that. Design as well that sort of alienates people from living. Because when you think about especially like urban centers and some rural areas, as well as like townships, a lot of people are thinking about identity, are thinking about place, are thinking about belonging. So fashion is one avenue to which you can think through, but as well read and analyze sort of where people are and where people are going. And there's something interesting, that Siviwe touched on with one of the guests, which was about how some of the stalwarts of like sort of thinking about human rights, thinking about this transition from apartheid to like democracy and all, came under a regime, right, that taught them to become certain people and also cast sort of labels and put them in categories, right? Such that when they get to a certain point, whether in the academy or just in their personal sort of practice in thinking about place, in thinking about rewriting things, they had to ask themselves questions about how do you think about yourself within this place, but how do you think about what this place needs to look like, needs to feel like, needs to do in order for, certain people, which are displaced people in this instance, to find good environments to habit, but as well as an extension of fighting for human rights, because the design itself, right, it suppresses. So how do we rethink that in order to help, and fashion as well, as more than just a form of expression, is an extension of language within these environments. So it's also about how people like Umamaga Siviwe are thinking about practice as a means of survival as well, which, is also attached to fashion, right? She makes things that are worn by people who want to express certain ideas and certain heritages. But it's also a way for her to answer a calling personally, but as well as, think about how do we create a practice that actually sustains me as a person.
Siviwe, would you like to just add a little bit to that before we move on to we have some questions in the chat that we can pose, and then, no, it's okay. Well, I do see, I'll just include into our conversation, and then we can always move into another round of questions, but someone in the chat has added an interesting question. So especially with notions of city making, do you acknowledge the systemic blockages that a community might have in having their artistic interventions recognized, celebrated, and upheld And while that's not directed to sort of any one of our guests in particular, I think it's a nice question for anyone or everyone to consider responding to, that relationship between sort of aesthetic fields and practices and the other sorts of systems and structures that creative practice are embedded within.
Is there anyone who feels inclined to answer this question?
Well, I think my reading of the question is, I think it raises something that I think all of you could speak to, which is just this idea of systemic blockages. You know, so where are the blockages coming from? Are they coming from the institutions? Are they coming from people not feeling there's any point in resisting or being more actively engaged from an activist perspective when it comes to art or fashion? Maybe you can all say something about these systemic blockages.
When I think about the algorithms of social media, as well as some of the algorithms that you know have formulated sort of this society that we found ourselves in, there are certain images that have been created, you know, that carry certain notions and uphold those notions. And mostly those notions do not carry forth or allow these knowledges that have been folded away, you know, to kind of exist and become and live within the main domain, and to influence thinking, to influence creativity, to influence imagination. Again, another one of the guests on the podcast spoke about how her practice, she's an image maker, right? She's speaking about her practice allows the people that she engages with in the environment within which she creates these images to express themselves how they want to be seen, which in many instances, it moves slightly away from how they've been told they need to perceive themselves, how they've been told they need to see themselves, express themselves, and show up, you know, in society. So there's kind of that thing where it's like, I think Instagram and sort of the rise of like the digital age is sort of allowing narratives to sort of find their way to people more than before, because, you know, the traditional modes and media sort of outlets, you know, were more controlled, and sort of, you know, the certain narratives that couldn't really find their way into the center and sort of influence imagination. So, and I think that also speaks to the importance of the podcast itself then, you know, because when people start listening, it starts inspiring other people to think, oh, within my environment, you see, like with the Benin, for instance, there are certain creators that could start thinking about, you know, what that culture means, what that practice means for them. With bark cloth that we just explored as well, it will inspire certain people to think about, oh, actually the tree is around us. Can we create fashion that is more secular, and then start to contribute into also fashion theory around, you know, building sustainable models and practices of creating fashion, and that is influenced by heritages and narratives that, you know, may not have been readily available and sort of made to live within the dominant narratives, right? And the domain. And sort of what that then does is help us, especially within the African context, to think about the future of fashion within the continent, inspired by the continent.
Thank you, Bongani. Is there anyone else who'd like to reflect on this notion of the sort of systemic blockages that your work is engaging, either in how you experience being blocked in the interventions you're offering in your environments, or how you are sort of analyzing and seeking to unstick some blockages? I have heard two really wonderful sort of metaphors or images for this recently. One, reading Sarah Ahmed's A Feminist Life and talking about being the institutional plumber, right? Identifying where things are blocked and trying to trying to get systems moving, and the other was actually via Erica thinking about the practice of acupuncture, right? How do you get things moving that are blocked? So I'm just, yeah, would love to hear reflections from either Peju or Theo and Ellie about how that reflects in your work.
Okay, I can take that question. When you talk about systemic blockages, for my project in Benin, I actually went in there with some trepidation because I know that Benin is a very structured society and not as flexible as one would want to have it as an artist. First of all, I did, when I was designing the costumes for the performers, I also thought about what color to use, because using red is like a sacred color, and cutting the fabrics to look exactly like what's they wear in the palace. I began to think about, what do I do? Do I change the color, make it really very different from the red that everybody knows? And then I thought, okay, let me try it out and see how people are going to react. So the artist has some kind of agency, but within the superstructure or culture, it's sometimes you could get some flax, in the sense that you cannot bridge tradition. It's a very set culture. It's not the Beninese take their traditions very seriously. Okay, for the casters, when I took the installation there, I also had to ask them with a lot of respect, will you want your works in this installation? First of all, they might look at it like, what is she doing? Why do you want me to bring my bronze works into a terracotta installation? Again, there's hierarchy when it comes to the materials. Metal cannot be seen on the same pedestal as terracotta. But they did, they obliged and put in their works. I was even very surprised to see the next day, after we had mounted the terracotta works, that the bronze works were there. And in fact, they brought out the choice pieces because they believed in that intervention. And indeed, after we returned, they kept asking if we were coming back the next year, and they wanted it to be an annual event. So it means that they were very happy with what they had experienced in Egun Street in that intervention. So I think that it's a very delicate space. You have to learn the balancing act as an artist going into those kind of societies. I probably will get away with it without much difficulty in Lagos. But even there, for those performers who are doing projects in Lagos space, they also complain about having to negotiate with touts, how to negotiate with local government officials. It's always a difficulty to go into that kind of public because everybody shares that space. In the case of Benin, it was not so easy, but somehow we got by. I don't know if I can.
Peju, we've lost your volume somehow. We've lost you. We can't hear you.
Good.
We can hear you now. No, but now you're gone again. It's okay. Maybe Theo wants to say something. We can't hear you, Peju.
Would you mind if?
Oh, now we can hear you. Yeah, I don't know. It might be a problem with the network.
Perhaps while we sort Peju's sound, I believe Erica has a question that she'd like to put to Red City Disco, and I'd love to hear the conversation between our guests emerge as well. I also note that there is at least one other question in the chat we can get to if time permits.
I would, but I think Sibiwe wanted to follow on from Peju. Sibiwe, did you want to just follow on before I kind of change track a bit?
Yeah, I did. I actually just wanted to add, when we think about these sort of blockages, especially with the analogies you used, and what is then opened up to flow again, I think of the podcast and how it was in particular the exercise of language. And if you noticed in the audio, we're speaking a lot of isiXhosa in it. And it was very intentional. As a post-apartheid creative, someone whose home language feels a little second language to her, the exercise of making the podcast became a work of internal releasing of blockages before it became an external, or it becomes an external releasing of blockages, language blockages, self-expression blockages. And so I found it quite interesting, the exercise of, as a Xhosa person conducting this sort of work, you know, you become quite highly sensitive to what is the fine line between creating content, and goes back to what Bongani was saying, you know, with social media, we're all creating content, but I've come to notice like context of the content, internal context and external context that supports then that final output. And so I've seen that through the makings of these works, there's a great internal dialogue that as the maker you have with your recipients. They come to want to understand now, why is it you're so interested in validating language that has been systematically told is second language or isn't as urgent in terms of us, our own owners of that language, coming to know and understand its value, and then everybody else from the outside. So there's quite an interesting transition between the internal conflicts that we're experiencing making the work, and then what we think the output's going to be at the end, if the audience, the main intended audience being amaXhosa, whether it's traditionalist amaXhosa and then our more contemporary Xhosas like me, how will they come to feel the discomforts? Will it be a similar agitation? And then what does this agitation do to maybe then how we respond on social media, and then the post-production conversations that happen with these material works? So for me as the maker of this podcast, it's been that, like the releasing of your own internal dialogues that you've had around validity of your culture, your identity, and then having community come to affirm or maybe even trouble what you perceived as your own strife with acceptance in today's world. So it's quite an interesting journey.
So much. Erica, would you like to pose your question then? We'll likely have time for maybe one or two more questions.
Absolutely. So it really is just kind of trying to think through where our work is kind of overlapping. And I think Theo and Jane, I think what is really interesting about what you're proposing is, and at the beginning you sort of said, you know, the work is not from the outset about decoloniality, and it's not from the outset framed in this framework, but really what you're offering through this kind of alternate route to healing, or alternate route to being heard in these spaces, I think is really important. And some of the decolonial work that I'm also very aware of in prompting the kinds of projects that we're doing is not continually repeating the violence. I think grappling with colonial blockages, grappling with the weight or the trauma of the colonial past, or the violence of oppression or migration or war. Sometimes actually another route, rather than going clambering over those rocks that are hurtful. So I mean, I think just as this, what is that work that you're doing, and what is the impact of that work that you're doing through joy, through this other set of feelings of visibilities, and what is the impact being within the community that you're working with?
Yeah, thank you. I think that does sort of summarizes maybe better than we did in that, yeah, arriving at a place which is maybe pre-political or with associations to people who have got quite focused political agenda, but arriving at that place through joy, through doing parties, through being part of a kind of a scene of people doing things like that in a city. But I mean, we both had experiences in more formal political contexts. I just think that yeah, I do think there's a secret association between something which is joyful and movements which are about liberation. I think there is obviously something there, and I guess we've tried to be quite kind of careful, how things are sort of how we make those connections, and because yeah, it's an obvious connection. And we don't want to take away from the fact that there's people who do political work, the boring stuff of who are door knocking, who are slogging it out in boring meetings in order to arrive at with a group some sort of consensus about how to move forward and do something materially shape something which is happening locally or nationally. So yeah, good feelings maybe are a key to our slightly dystopian times, I think. Yeah, I don't know.
I think as well for me that the artistic elements was like a catalyst of the joy and play and creativity, and facilitating that with the groups that we've been fundraising for evidenced how important it is for a human to experience creativity and play and in a community environment. And even with the bus project that we did, we then carried that out of the party environment, out of the Bridewell space, and I went down to pick the bus with Asylum Link, and we made stencils that were made from artwork that the asylum seekers had previously made, and then they spray painted them onto the bus, and you could see this like full circle kind of notion and how that positively impacted them and the joy and affirmation that they seemed to get from that experience. And I think in my experience working in that context with asylum seekers and refugees, it takes them away from that name or that title of the position they are in society, and it just is about the creativity that they're making and the joy that comes from that as well.
Thank you so much for those two interventions. We're really nearly almost out of time, but we've got one more question in the chat, and I just want to try and ask it of Peju. I don't know if you'll be able to respond because if your sound is working, but I know you can hear us. So the question is, what kind of impact does the return of objects by colonizers have on the communities, institutions, identities at home? Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, I will respond by saying that it has a very huge impact. I was in Benin in the Palace of the King in 2014 when Adrian Walker returned those two bronze works that he inherited. And the palace was full, the palace ground was full of people from all over, from different communities and guilds. They were there to celebrate, not just for the Benin City example in Nigeria, but also the Republic of Benin. When the works were returned, the people lined the streets. They were excited about it. They were very happy to see these things return. Works returned from Aberdeen and Cambridge. It was the same kind of reaction. And there was so much celebration. And the king took those two works to Egaoba, which is the place where this will have been taken away in the first instance, where the shrines of his forefathers are. And the entire crowd went with the king to perform a rite, to say that these things have come back to where they actually belong. It's a very satisfying feeling, and it's always an occasion for celebration. And we welcome many more returns because it's such a satisfying thing for not just the people who are the artists or those who connect directly to it, but for the entire country to have work were stolen, returned, And I think that that is so important to change the narrative from looted art to art that's perhaps loaned to these spaces that once held these works captive. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Peju. I think, unfortunately, we are coming to a close now of our session. There are many more questions that we all probably have in our minds and don't have the time to express now. But I think we really had an exciting session that linked, very different practices in very different places. And I think there's lots more to think about in the future. So, and I hope in our Decolonial Cities Collective, we continue to engage in these conversations. Thanks so much to our speakers today for joining us today. That was really super interesting and enlightening. And thanks to all the participants also, and for those of you also specifically who had questions. Thanks so much. And yeah, we hope to see you at our next dialogue in the future.
Yes, and can I just add that along with thanks from both myself, Angela, and the rest of the collective, is that all of you who are registered will receive a link to the video. So hopefully you'll share it, and hopefully this can stimulate more conversations. And please keep an eye on our website, because we have other dialogues in the making and in the planning. And really, we hope this is like a stimulus injection for more conversation. So even if your questions were not answered today because we ran out of time, please do drop us a line or an email, and we're trying to compile these as a way to see avenues forward with these conversations and also future collaborations. So reach out to us. We're very open to engage with everybody around the world. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you so much. Have a good day, everyone.